Okay, so far we have two of the foundational cards to support the solution to the explanatory gap. We have the idea that the mind is representational, and we have the consumer theory of representation that ties biological function to the capacity to represent. So now we need to move on to the consciousness side of the house of cards to try to figure out how consciousness is involved in this story. And so we need to go back to the way in which consciousness is what David Chalmers called a hard problem. So according to Chalmers, the easy problems are easy because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it's not a problem about the performance of function. So according to Chalmers, you have the easy problems, which are the things that I mentioned earlier, which is the kinds of things we have a better grasp on at this point, mental phenomena like memory and learning and perception. We're getting a grip on those. So Chalmers calls those the easy problems. We understand what the function is of memory, to hang on to things. Learning, we understand the function is to acquire new information, to perceive things. We understand what those functions are, and so we've been able to look for the physical systems that do those functions. But Chalmers thinks that the consciousness is a hard problem because it's not functional. It's just there. And what I want to argue is that consciousness does serve a function, but we need to try to figure out what that function is. And that's the key to solving the hard problem. So in order to be able to do this, we need to think more about our conscious experience. We need to think about what's essential to conscious experience in order to figure out what it might possibly be doing to help us. And I went back to a philosopher who thought a lot about consciousness, who considered what were the essential features of conscious experience, and that is Edmund Husserl. He was the founder of the school of phenomenology, which is the study of phenomena, the study of conscious experiences. And according to Husserl, consciousness has a temporal structure. So for Husserl, it was important that consciousness be about the present moment, that consciousness is about what we're experiencing now, that's the content of conscious experience, is temporality. And he talked about it in terms of this phenomenal structure of the present moment, that consciousness binds sights, sounds, thoughts, and feelings into this experience of the present moment. And the other essential feature that consciousness has is that it's in flux, that we move in the stream of consciousness, and that's a term from a contemporary of Husserl, William James, that we move in a stream of consciousness, that this set of experiences that we're having right now, this set of representations of sights and sounds and feelings, changes each moment, that I'm having this experience now, and this experience now, and this experience now, and that happens in this flow from one moment to the next. So I've argued that these two essential features of consciousness, that consciousness is unified and that it flows, helps us think about the essential nature of consciousness as a representation of the present moment. And this is the critical third card in explanation of consciousness in my house of cards, is a definition of consciousness as a representation of the present moment. The definition of consciousness in terms of a representation of presence is essential to tie phenomenology, the experience of consciousness, to its function and to behavior. So a representation of the world now is not simply a representation that's occurring now. There are all kinds of representations that one has that stay unconscious, that you're maybe experiencing the sound of my voice, and you're experiencing, various visual representations and maybe some thoughts, but probably you're not experiencing the sensations that allow you to maintain your posture, for example. Maybe you start thinking about your posture, and then those sensations become conscious, become part of your conscious representation of what's happening now. But a lot of representations stay unconscious, and one of the critical questions is why? Why do some representations get selected into a representation of the present moment, and why do some remain unconscious? And that is part of the story of function, I think. Illusions can help us understand why some representations are selected and why they operate in the way that they operate. And the illusions help us do this by showing us how misrepresentation occurs. In this freezing rotation illusion, the words are rotating steadily, but they appear to freeze when the background rotation is in sync. So it sort of looks like the words are turning and then stopping, and then turning and then stopping. Max Durstler, who works on motion illusions, suggests that this visual system ignores regular motion of the smaller object, the words, in order to treat it as part of the larger surround, the striped colors that are moving around. In other words, motion representation is suppressed when the figure matches the ground. So what we see as now, whether it's a stationary or a moving object, is not necessarily what's occurring now, because what's occurring now is that they're both rotating. They're both rotating the whole time. So what we're representing as now, what we take to be our conscious representation of the present moment, isn't what's occurring now, and it's not even what's occurring now in the world. It's what is the best approximation according to what our system has been designed to represent, and according to what our goals are at the current moment. A representational system needs to know what's occurring now in order to respond in different ways depending on how things are going. Maybe everything's okay, but maybe there should be a change in plan. So you need to represent the present moment in order to have the flexibility to change what's going on based on the current representational situation. So I've argued that the function of consciousness is to represent the present moment, that the consumer semantic theory of representation shows how representational content is tied to its function, that a representation varies isomorphically with what it represents. So a conscious representation of now varies according to the present moment, varies according to a set of representations that it takes to be the present in order to serve some function for the system. The system has found a particular sort of selection of representations to be useful in the past. And so what we need to think about then is, what is that use? Why does a system have a representation of now? Why is the system representing the present moment? And I've argued that consciousness tells us what is happening now in order to facilitate the flexible selection and pursuit of goals. That the function of a representation of the present moment is descriptive, it's not directive. That consciousness itself doesn't tell us what to do, it tells us what's going on now so that our other systems can determine what the best response is at the present moment. It says what's happening now so the system can determine what to do next. Your representation of now can't do you any good now, and that's because it takes a certain amount of time to compose. So you have your stimuli out in the world. It takes some time for the stimulus to hit your sensory organs. You know, all of the light and the sound waves need to travel through the air to hit your organs, and then they need to get processed through the rest of your visual system and your auditory system, and then they need to be put together to create a conscious representation. So a lot of what happens unconsciously, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it takes time for your conscious representation to be produced. So it can't, you know, tell you what to do now. It can only tell you what's going on now. And it takes some time then for you to be able to respond. But a representation of now is important to distinguish the past from the future, and that is necessary to evaluate progress. So here we have an example of two different kinds of responses, one that can happen unconsciously and one that can happen consciously. On the unconscious side, you have automatic inflexible action. So here's the baby sticking the hand near the stove, and the unconscious system will immediately withdraw the hand so that you know, the burn is not severe. If the conscious system had to be activated in order for a reflex response like hand withdrawal, there would be a lot more burns, or burns would be a lot more serious. Our reflex system and our unconscious responses happen in order to be most effectively responsive to the world. So they can happen when there's an input to the system and the system knows exactly what to do in response to that input. Whereas you need a conscious response. In the picture on the right, you have this child who's looking at the pot that's boiling, or perhaps not yet boiling, and you need conscious response for a controlled, flexible action, that as the child is watching this pot, different things could happen. The child could get pulled away, decide to make something else instead of boiled water. There are different kinds of things that could happen. And so you need consciousness when there are different possible goals or different possible actions in relation to ongoing stimuli. There's a very familiar experience that helps illustrate the role of the unconscious and the conscious, and that has to do with driving, regular driving. So you're driving along and you want to head to the grocery store to pick some milk up on the way home from the office, and you're driving and suddenly you find yourself at home. You've forgotten to go and pick up milk. That's the unconscious system that's just sending you on your way home and not able to make any sort of flexible responses. You're maybe thinking about some things, you're things that happened at work or things that you want to do when you get home, and your consciousness is wrapped up in those kinds of thoughts and reflections. And so you're not really paying attention to what's going on in the world, that your driving is mostly unconscious. And so you get home in a purely habitual sort of way. You needed to be conscious in order to be able to keep track of where you're going and what you're doing in order to deviate from this kind of standard path that you took when you were on your way home. But you need to be conscious of driving. You can't drive unconsciously, because there's always the possibility of some unexpected event that happens that you need to be able to keep track of. And so when you're driving, my argument would be that you are having conscious sensory and conceptual representations, that those are being integrated into your representation of now, but they fly by. If your attention isn't integrating the information about what you need to do that diverges from your usual unconscious processes, your habitual processes of engaging the steering wheel and stopping at traffic lights and so forth. If that deviation isn't being consciously included in your representation of the present moment, then that will not be able to direct you in terms of flexible responses. That your conscious experiences will just move you, along the way towards your habitual destination, which is your home. You have to be conscious while you're driving, even though you don't have to be conscious of driving. You don't have to be conscious of exactly what's going on, where your hands are. You don't have to be paying attention to when you're stopping on the brake pedal or the gas pedal or what have you. The contents of your consciousness can be occupied listening to the radio, having a conversation, looking at the beautiful day. Most of what goes on regarding the manipulation of the wheel, stopping for traffic lights and so forth, escapes your attention. If something unexpected happens, a crash or an emergency vehicle, your conscious representation immediately incorporates that information, which is fed into the decision-making system to facilitate response. The most important responses are likely the unconscious ones. You put your foot on the brake and then you stop and you move over to the side of the road. But your conscious representations then will shift from whatever it was you were thinking about to being immediately present in the current environment. So the fourth card in the House of Cards is flexibility, which I think is the key function to consciousness. Why we're conscious in order to respond flexibly to the present moment. So representations of the present moment facilitate flexible action. And in order to try to operationalize this concept of flexibility, it's a very useful idea that we're flexible, that we can change in response to the conditions of the environment. But it's very difficult to operationalize, to say how flexibility is distinct from simply learning from the past and responding to the present based on your past responses. So flexibility is more of a complex decision-making sort of capacity than simply learning based on the past responses. And the one way to illustrate the critical functional levels of development is to look at Dan Dennett's Tower of Generate and Test, where he has described this relation of development, like how minds develop from basic Darwinian creatures at the base level, creatures that are capable of adapting genetically to conditions. So good genes live and bad genes die. That's one form of ways in which an animal can adapt and improve. The second layer is the layer of Skinnerian creatures. And here's where learning enters, and positive and negative reinforcement then allows the creature to change in its lifetime. And the Skinnerian level is the level of push-me-pull-you representations, where a specific stimulus determines a specific response based on the past relationship between the descriptive situation and the directive response. The next level on Dennett's Tower of Generate and Test is the level of Popperian creature, where a creature can respond in different ways to a set of stimuli. So this is the level of flexibility. Popperian creatures can be flexible. They're not just weighing past associations or making generalizations. There's not a one-to-one stimulus response relation. It's complex weightings of many to many relations. So there are many possible interpretations of your current environment, and there are many possible responses to the current environment, depending on what your goals are and depending on what your past experiences have been. So it's a much more complex development than the Skinnerian creature. And so in my account, the Popperian creature is where consciousness enters. And I'll just pause a moment on this diagram to point out that the highest level of Gregorian creature is where language and culture enter. And so in my view, consciousness enters prior to that more complex kind of development of cultural evolution and language, which is arguably, the Gregorian creatures are arguably the level of human evolution. Whether other animals are Gregorian or not, I am not going to say as far in terms of this video. I don't make any claims in my book either, but I do want to make my critical claim is that consciousness enters at the level of movement from a Skinnerian to a Popperian creature. So the 4 ways that I've developed to operationalize flexibility, I developed in collaboration with the late Victoria Braithwaite, and they are here listed. The first one, differential response to the environment, is the most general way of operationalizing flexibility, and it basically is included in all the others. All the others also involve differential response to the environment. And that just means that in relation to incoming input, you can do different things in response. And in the book and in the work that I've done with Victoria, we've talked about different examples for each of these ways of operationalizing flexibility. So you can look to our work, look to the book and our work for examples from fish species on how to illustrate these different sorts of forms of flexibility. Because we think that there are species of fish that do exhibit flexible responses. And I think one of the most important ways in which this description of consciousness, this theory of consciousness is important, is in helping us better understand animal consciousness. So how is it that consciousness evolves? Why does it evolve? And therefore, which animals would have needed the adaptation to become conscious animals? Which animals are conscious, most likely conscious, and which animals are not, most likely not conscious? It's not definitive, largely because we don't have a clear operational description. We don't have tests for flexibility yet. But I think if we accept this theory and if we develop tests for flexibility, then we could say more definitively which animals are conscious. It's going to be another question about definitively ruling out animals as unconscious, but I think we get a better grasp on where to make that kind of a judgment. And if we're inclined to say that, for example, C. elegans is not conscious, as I am inclined to say C. elegans is not conscious, we have better reasons for making that kind of a claim. So, as I said, the first way of operationalizing flexibility is in terms of differential response. The second way is adaptation to novel situations, and this is where future conditions are based on information that's learned in the past. A combination of features never before experienced simultaneously is what is involved in a novel response. So you've got an unusual situation. So it's not good enough to have learned something about feature A or feature B. The animal needs to represent both feature A and feature B as part of the situation now in order to know how to respond to this particular combination. So that's what makes a response a novel response for the animal, is taking a combination of things learned at different past events, and recognizing that they're both here now and that requires a particular kind of response. Third, manipulation of the environment to accomplish goals. And here you're able to represent the difference between how things are now and how they will be when the goal is won, in order to determine what action now is going to bring about that goal. So the goal is not now, and you need to assess the current situation in order to be able to get that absent goal. Tool use is a good example of this, where the animal is using an object that the animal doesn't have any use for otherwise, except to get to some non-existent goal. So the animal uses this tool to get something else in order to get the goal. Other sorts of non-flexible kinds of action is just, so if you want some food item, then you can just, like operate on that food item and do different things to try to get at it. That's not necessarily flexible, because it could just be, a matter of trial and error learning, which is a Skinnerian sort of capacity. And then the fourth way of demonstrating flexible behavior is explicit representation of absent feature. And any representation of what is present entails the corollary that you're capable of representing absence. And, this may seem counterintuitive or even false, but the point is that the possibility of absence is necessary to make presence meaningful. If all you are able of representing is what there is, as in a push-me-pull-you sort of representation, then you have no reason to represent absence either. So it's just that whatever is here is what you do in relation, is what your response is. So you need to be able to represent absence in order to be able to represent goals that are not current, that are things that you might want to pursue. The ability to represent a goal as not present requires that you be able to represent the present and represent that the goal is not part of this, in order to consider different ways to pursue that absent goal. And my argument is that consciousness is needed to be able to pursue things that are not here. You need to be able to stop time between, the past that has supplied you with the information about learning, about what kinds of responses are useful, from, a particular response that the past might determine that you make. That if you are capable of doing two different things, you need to be able to stop from the accumulation of information to the action on that information, to be able to consider what's going on now. Is my action the best action for the kinds of things that I might want? Do I need to shift and pursue a different goal? Do I need to shift my actions in order to better accomplish the goal that I have in mind? So now we have a solution to the explanatory gap. This is being able to place the final card on top of our 4 other cards. Our solution to the explanatory gap then connects the description of the nature of consciousness, consciousness as a representation of the present moment, with its function, that it has the function of representing the present. The phenomenological structure of consciousness and flexible behavior both require a representation of presence. So the function of consciousness is to represent the world as it is now. The hard problem has become one of the easy problems now, because we have a sense of what the function of consciousness is. And so we can look for how that function is performed in humans and animals, and that will tell us why we're conscious and how we're conscious. So here is the temporal theory of consciousness in its full form. Here are all of the cards. The mind card, that the mind is representational. The representation card, that to represent is to have the function of varying isomorphically with the represented. The definition card, consciousness is defined as a representation of the present moment. The function card, flexible response, requires a representation of the present moment. And then finally the bridge card, that explanation ties the description of consciousness with its function. And so this is the house of cards. If you pull out any of these cards, then the house falls, or could fall. It'll be up to others to see if you could put in a different theory of representation, if you could support the mental side of the house of cards in some other way, or if you could have a different definition of consciousness with the consciousness card or the function card. But at least I've provided you, or I hope to have provided you, with an understanding of how it could be possible to explain consciousness in terms of evolutionary processes, in terms of physical processes like a brain, and that we could see how consciousness could be continuous with very, very simple forms of representation, and it could develop the capacity to be more complex by virtue of the kinds of function that consciousness performs. So if you like this theory of consciousness and you'd like to know more about it and get more detail, I encourage you to check out my book, Evolution of Consciousness Representing the Present Moment, available from Bloomsbury Press, where I go through all of these points in much more detail. And I try to do it in an engaging way to make it accessible even to non-specialists in consciousness theory.